The hum of the warship Talon's Edge was constant, like a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through every cold steel wall and carbon fiber corridor. But it did nothing to drown out the truth. The brig had grown too quiet. Human pilot Rian Holt walked the length of the corridor for the third time that hour, pretending to inspect the wall panels, pretending to be just another tired officer on patrol. But in truth, every nerve in his body pulled him back to Celsius 7, not because he wanted to, because he couldn't stop himself. It was wrong. It was dangerous. It was treason. But she was there, behind that transparent energy field, shackled at wrists and ankles, her strange violet eyes duller than they were yesterday, the alien princess. The one who'd been captured during the burning of Kale Sector. The one they called the Crimson Bane, the enemy. But she was no monster. She hadn't spoken a word in 3 days, hadn't lifted her head since they transferred her from planetary custody. Still, Rian saw her flinch every time footsteps passed, as if expecting a new tormentor, another round of invasive scans or interrogation cycles. The official orders were to keep her alive barely until a diplomatic ship arrived to collect her for public execution on Europa Prime. Until then, she was property, evidence, propaganda. Rian had seen prisoners before. Combatants, spies, pirates, but this wasn't that. She was bruised, starved, shackled as though she might leap out and murder a battalion with her bare hands. She looked barely old enough to command anything, let alone lead an assault. Rumors said she had killed a general with her voice. Others whispered she bled stardust and could warp the minds of men. Rian didn't believe in ghost stories, but he believed in cruelty. And this, the way she had been kept in the coldest part of the ship, with no translator, no bedding, no light. This was cruelty. He hadn't meant to notice. The war was personal for him, too. He'd lost a brother in the siege of Eros. He'd watched half his squadron die screaming when the alien fleet blacked out Earth's outer defenses. He should have hated her. But he didn't, he couldn't, because 3 nights ago, when he was fixing a blown fuse in the brig hallway, the power flickered just long enough for her restraints to go dark, and instead of attacking or escaping, she had crawled toward the power conduit and reconnected it herself. She could have fled, could have killed him, but she didn't. She just knelt in the dark, one hand on the sparking panel, staring at him like she wasn't sure if she had saved him or doomed herself. That had been the first moment. Since then, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about her, the eyes, the silence, the quiet, regal way she never begged or spoke or demanded anything even while starving. She was no threat now, just a prisoner of war waiting to die, and somehow that felt wrong. That felt wrong enough that Rian began doing small things, leaving his rounds slower near her cell, making sure her water was cold. Once, slipping half of his ration into the intake tray he'd lied on his log, and claimed it jammed. He told himself he was just being decent, that it didn't matter, that no one would notice. But yesterday, when she had looked up as the tray slid in, her lips dry and cracked, and whispered something in her language that the computer couldn't translate, but sounded a lot like, "Thank you," he knew he had already crossed a line. He couldn't uncross. The alarms that morning snapped him out of it. A red alert flared across the bridge as 2 enemy cruisers broke from a nearby moon's shadow and opened fire. The Talon's Edge shuddered. Explosions rocked the outer decks. Fires in Sector 12. Command decks scrambling to respond. Rian ran for the pilot bay, took the helm as instructed, flew defensive patterns. Standard procedure, the chaos of war. But behind all of it, in the back of his head, one thought echoed louder than the sirens: if this ship goes down, she dies chained to a wall. No trial, no mercy, not even the chance to run. That thought stuck with him long after the skirmish ended and the crew limped back into standard formation. It was irrational, it was madness. But it rooted itself in his brain like gravity. So, when the emergency codes reset that night, and the brig was placed on skeleton security rotation, and the backups were too distracted with hull repair to double-check logs, Rian knew what he had to do. He waited until 0300, slipped out of his quarters in his pilot jumpsuit, Swapped his security key for a blank log chip he'd pre-programmed to spoof his patrol route. He'd studied every shift change, timed the lights, practiced the override sequence in a dead section of the training bay. It was treason, it was suicide, but he did it anyway. The hallway to the brig was dark. The emergency lighting pulsed in a slow, tired rhythm. He moved quietly, boots barely brushing the floor. When he reached cell CO7, the princess was awake, sitting cross-legged, watching him, not startled, just waiting, as if she already knew. Maybe she did. He didn't speak. Not yet. He dropped to his knees, hands shaking as he slid the override tool into the cell's side panel. The interface flickered, locked. He cursed under his breath. Recalibrated. Overrode the standard key with his hack subroutine. The field blinked, buzzed, and dropped with a soft whoosh. She didn't move, her eyes locked on his. He raised a hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "You're getting out of here." Still, she didn't move. "Do you understand me?" he asked, holding out a hand. She stared at it, then at him. Then slowly, with aching hesitation, crawled forward. Her shackles clinked with every motion. He whispered, crouching to unlock them. The cuffs were fused tight. He pulled out the microtorch. His fingers were trembling. The metal hissed and gave. One by one, the restraints dropped. Her hands were raw. "Her ankle's worse. Can you walk?" he asked. She stood barely. Her legs buckled. He caught her. She leaned into him, weight featherlight but shaking. No sound, no sob, no anger. Just trembling silence. Rian pulled his backup jacket from his pack and wrapped it around her. "We have 10 minutes, he said. "If anyone sees us," he didn't finish. They both knew what would happen. They moved through the corridor like ghosts. Through maintenance hatches, down access ladders. Past the sleeping crew, Rian's heart pounded like a drum. Every creak felt like an alarm. Every corner might mean death. When they reached the lower hangar, the bay was dark, but 2 escape pods were still docked. One was a dummy training model. The other was real? He loaded her into it, calibrated the nav. System for an uncharted moon with breathable atmosphere and no outposts, and locked the coordinates. Then he hesitated. She looked at him from the pod seat, eyes wide, breath shaking. She still hadn't spoken. "I don't know if this is mercy," he said. "Or if I'm just making a mistake I can't take back." She lifted a hand, touched his chest, a small gesture. Barely a breath of contact, but in her eyes something shifted. Not fear, not thanks. Something deeper, recognition. She said something again. Same word, same tone. As before, the translator couldn't parse it, but somehow he understood it, and it broke him. The pod sealed. He stepped back, hit the launch button. The bay doors groaned open. The pod ejected into the stars like a quiet breath in the night. Rian stood there long after she was gone, heart hollow, ears ringing. He had just committed treason. Freed the most valuable prisoner of the war, thrown away everything he had. For what? A name he didn't know, a girl he barely understood. A cause he couldn't explain, but he didn't regret it, not yet. Maybe not ever. Behind him, alarms began to howl. Red lights danced on the walls. The brig override had finally tripped. They would know, they would come. He turned and walked back toward the flames, alone. He was a soldier, he was a pilot. He was a traitor now. But for the first time since the war began, he felt human again. The escape pod drifted silently through a field of cosmic dust, tumbling slightly as its guidance system fought the wake of the warship's gravity field. And inside, the alien princess clutched the edges of the harness, her hands blistered from shackles, her skin sensitive to the recycled air, her body bruised from days without rest, but she said nothing. Not even to the pod's automated translator, because her language wasn't just sound, it was emotion, nuance, coded frequencies the human machine couldn't parse. And more than that, she didn't trust her voice anymore, not after they'd ripped her silence apart with electric prods and interrogators who only wanted her to confirm the Empire's worst fears. And now, as the stars slid past the reinforced view glass, She realized something she hadn't dared believe until the moment the pod launched. She was free. Not completely, not safely, not forever, but for now, in this thin corridor of stolen time, she was no longer chained. And that truth pulsed in her chest louder than the low thrum of the pod systems, louder than the humming of distant systems flaring to life behind the control panel, louder even than the memory of the human pilot's hand brushing hers before. The door sealed shut, his eyes conflicted, haunted, and strangely gentle. So, unlike the others who spoke with violence dripping from their mouths and carried righteousness like a badge of cruelty, and as she drifted farther from the warship, her mind replayed that last look, his lips parting as if he wanted to say her name, though he didn't know it, couldn't pronounce it, and had no idea what her title truly meant, because in his tongue she was only ever the alien, the prisoner, the threat. And yet, when he looked at her, he didn't see a species or a weapon or a trophy. He saw her. And that was more dangerous than any executioner's blade, more powerful than the fleets that had burned her homeworld, because it meant someone still believed she was more than a symbol, more than a war, and that belief, however small, however foolish, had cracked something inside her that had been hardened like stone since the day her father's palace fell, and she'd crawled through blood and ash and swore never to trust a human again. Yet now here she was, floating through neutral space, carrying the warmth of a human jacket still clinging to her shoulders, and the memory of him whispering, "You're getting out of here," as though those words alone were enough to defy gravity, protocol, and death itself. But the escape wouldn't mean anything unless she survived the next hours, and that meant she had to act. So she leaned forward, fingers still trembling, tapping commands into the pod's control system using the encoded numeric gestures of her species, but bypassing human security layers the same way she once hacked a blockade shield in her academy trials. And when the navlogs flared open, she purged them immediately, wiped the last coordinates clean, burned the trace, then angled the pod toward a system marked only in ancient star charts, the third moon of a brown dwarf known to the humans as D4 Ryath, unclaimed, unstable, and known to her people only as Telenar, a name whispered by mystics as cursed, abandoned, dangerous, and ideal for hiding from both sides of a war too vast to outrun. And when the pod accepted her new course, the burn ignited. Soft and subtle, not enough to ping a scan net, but enough to adjust trajectory by light hours, and she collapsed back into the chair, heart racing as the pod began its new descent, its systems hissing like a sleeping animal, and for a brief moment the cold gave way to warmth. A flicker of heat from the emergency blanket he'd stuffed into the seat before sending her off, and she pulled it tighter, not because she was cold, but because she was still shaking and her thoughts kept folding in on themselves. Why had he helped her? What did he risk? What would they do to him? And why had he looked so calm when the alarms started ringing behind him? As if the betrayal was already worth the price, as if he'd made peace with what he'd lost the moment she was launched into the stars. And she didn't know his name, not his real one, only the name she had assigned him silently after he first left Fudrian, a word in her native tongue that meant those who walk against fire, a name once reserved for warriors who broke from their ranks to protect the innocent, even when it meant dishonor, exile, or death. And she wondered if he would be alive when the dawn broke, wondered if she would ever see him again, or if this strange intersection of fate would collapse like the dying stars between their two species. And she didn't let herself mourn yet. Because mourning was dangerous, mourning made her slow, and slow meant dead. Especially now, especially alone, so instead she focused on the controls, calibrated the crash-landing thrusters, timed the drop, and then silence again, long, crushing silence broken only by the pod's final burn and the hiss of entry as the moon's pale atmosphere clawed at the hull like a hungry ghost, pulling her down through thick clouds of methane fog, down through orange lightning and shattered rock, down toward the surface of a world no one sane dared call home. And when the pod slammed into the cracked surface of Telenar, she felt every bruise scream, but the hull held, the seals hissed, and the systems powered down in phases, one by one, until the only sound left was the soft clicking of cooling metal and the shallow, desperate rhythm of her breathing, and still, she didn't cry, not yet, not even when the airlock hissed and the doors opened and she saw the broken wasteland stretch before her like the bones of a dead god, just sharp rock, endless black ice, sulfur storms on the horizon, and a sliver of sky glowing violet through the thick clouds, and still, she didn't cry. Not even when she stepped out barefoot onto the cold dust and fell to her knees, not from weakness, but from the weight of something heavier: freedom, survival, memory, and the sudden realization that someone had cared enough to give her a second chance. And with trembling hands, she touched the dirt, touched the wind, touched the wound on her shoulder where the guards had branded her with a human symbol, then slowly dug into her pocket and pulled out the small metal pin she'd ripped from Rian's collar just before the pod door sealed, a symbol of his rank. Nothing more, but in her hands it became something sacred, something foolish, something untranslatable, and as she closed her fingers around it, she whispered a word that had no equivalent in human speech, a word that meant "I see you and I won't forget, and you matter all at once." And she buried the pin beneath a stone beside the wreck, marking it like a grave or a promise, then turned and limped toward the cave she'd seen from the descent window, dragging the emergency pack behind her, breath shallow, skin freezing, but something burning inside her stronger than warmth, something dangerously close to hope. And far behind her, light years away, aboard Talon's Edge, Rian Holt stood on the bridge in restraints, surrounded by soldiers he once called friends, staring down a tribunal of commanders demanding explanation, loyalty, obedience, and all he said was, "I let her go." And when they shouted treason and betrayal and execution, he didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't deny, because in the back of his mind, through all the chaos and fury and the weight of consequences crashing like meteors on his shoulders, he held on to one image: her eyes in the dark, the way she looked at him, not with hate, not even with fear, but with something wordless and sacred and impossibly old. And in that moment, even with a death sentence looming and every title stripped from him, Rian Holt knew one thing with more certainty than he'd ever known: the flight path of a fighter jet or the feel of a ship's joystick in battle. He had done the right thing. And even if it meant he never saw starlight again, he would never regret choosing her. The caves of Telenar were blacker than deep space, lined with obsidian that absorbed sound and time alike, and the alien princess moved carefully through the narrow paths with bloodied feet and cracked ribs, her breath forming weak clouds in the chill, her fingers trailing along the ancient symbols etched into the rock markings older than the war, older even than her species' recorded history, left behind by the Star Mothers, by those who had fled here long before either race had built their first ships. And though she couldn't read them, she felt them like a pulse through her bones, and she followed that pull deeper into the mountain until the entrance collapsed behind her in a sulfur quake, sealing her in and silencing the outside world entirely. And still she pressed on, not because she believed rescue would come, because it wouldn't, not from her people who thought her dead, or from his who would have her executed, but because she had made a vow as the pod fell through the clouds, not to survive for herself, but to survive for him, for Rian Holt, the human pilot who had looked at her chains and seen something worth saving. And though she didn't understand what she meant to him or why he had given up everything to set her free, she had felt it, that terrible, beautiful, sacred feeling her people called Elverith, the binding of lives through impossible decisions, and now she clung to it, starved, freezing, alone, but not broken, never broken, because he had believed in her when she no longer did, and that belief was fire enough to carry her forward, even when her vision blurred and her steps slowed and her wounds reopened and the cave began to spin like the sky outside a broken airlock, and when she finally collapsed in the heart of the cave, where a strange warmth pulsed from the rock, an underground pocket of geothermal breath, she curled around herself, clutching the emergency ration pack he had stuffed into her bag, and let herself sleep for the first time in weeks, not because she was safe, but because something inside her whispered that she might be worth saving after all. And while she slept, storms screamed across the surface of Telenar, carving her tracks from the ground. And far away on Talon's Edge, Rian Holt sat inside a solitary cell deep beneath the ship's reactor core, stripped of uniform and rank and freedom, but not regret, never regret. Because though the tribunal had sentenced him to silence, to a permanent exile in the bowels of the ship with no window and no voice, he still carried her memory like a torch, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw her fingers closing around the edge of the escape pod, saw the faint nod she'd given him before vanishing into the void. And he smiled, faintly, brokenly, but truly, because he had saved her. And nothing they took from him could change that, but what he didn't know, what no one aboard Talons. Edge knew was that a private message beacon had pulsed once before the pod vanished, launched not toward human command, but toward a long-dead satellite of her people's old signal net. A hidden frequency buried in the Star Mother codes that only a few even remembered, and from that pulse, word had spread, not across fleets, not across nations, but across whispers, across the few scattered remnants of her kind still hiding in. The dust priests, refugees, old spies and broken queens who once served the throne and thought her line extinguished, and now, across a dozen moons and forgotten ruins, a ripple began to stir because the message was simple, but impossible. She lives, and those two words, though faint, lit a spark in dark places where hope had long since turned to ash. And weeks passed in silence before the first ship came to Teleanor, small and weather-worn, shaped like no vessel the humans had ever catalogued, moving through the sulfur clouds like a ghost, landing near the shattered pod in a storm that buried its hull in dust and static, and when the door opened, the figure who stepped out wore no crown, no armor, no banners, just a breathing mask and a trembling hand holding the pin she had buried, which the storms had unearthed and left gleaming on the stone like an offering, and the old warrior bent down and whispered her name, her true name, the one that hadn't been spoken since the day the palace burned, and when she opened her eyes in the cave and saw him kneeling, weeping, she didn't know whether to believe it was real or if she had finally died in her sleep, but the hand that touched her cheek was warm, and the voice that cracked said only one thing, "The stars remember," and for the first time she wept, not from fear or pain or loss, but from the unbearable weight of being found, of being believed. And when they carried her aboard the old ship and wrapped her in blankets older than the war itself, she closed her eyes again and whispered one word, Rian, and the name passed through the halls like prophecy, like purpose. And as she healed among the ruins of a forgotten moon, her strength slowly returned, and the fragments of her identity began to reform, not as a prisoner, not as a princess, but as something new, something forged in silence and fire and human. Mercy, and she began to speak again, teaching the survivors her vision. Not of vengeance, not of retaliation, but of return, of rebuilding, of reaching back across the void, not with blades, but with truth, and when the time came to fly again, to build a new throne not carved from the bones of war, but from the memory of kindness, she made only one request, that they send a message not to the leaders of Earth, not to the armadas that would still hunt her, but to a single man, still rotting in a brig aboard a forgotten warship orbiting a minor sun. And the message was short, translated carefully by a diplomat who once studied human linguistics before the war began, and it arrived quietly in the night, slipped past firewalls and sensor grids and encrypted bunkers, until it landed in Rian Holt's cell, projected on the wall by an old service drone he hadn't seen in months, and all it said, in his own language, was this: I survived. I remember. You were right, and when he read it, he didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even move, just sat with his head against the wall, heart thudding louder than the engines above, and for the first time in months, he laughed, soft and bitter and full of light, because somehow, impossibly, she had made it, and even if he never saw the stars again, even if he died in that metal tomb, he knew now that something beautiful had grown from his choice, something unstoppable, and far across the galaxy, the alien princess stood on the bridge of a reclaimed vessel with no flag, staring at a star map full of broken empires, and whispered to herself the word he had never heard her say aloud, home. And when the ship turned toward the edge of known space, toward the last place he had ever been seen, her voice carried across the silence of the void, not as a cry of war, but as a promise to the human who gave up his world for hers, that she would not let the stars forget him. Not now, not ever.